I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is James Corbett, editor of the CorbettReport.com and contributing journalist to the International Forecaster. Welcome back to the show, James.
Thank you for having me on. Always a pleasure to be here.
Watching from Japan, has the Donald Trump show caught the attention of the populace?
It certainly has. I think it can't fail to do so, especially when Trump has been talking so much about the relationship with a number of different trading partners, but Japan in particular, and of course leveling his criticism at the Japanese car manufacturing industry as being unfair. And of course, Japanese car manufacturing is probably the prime contributor to the Japan-U.S. balance of trade surplus in Japan's case, or deficit in the U.S. case. So I think that's obviously a pretty important point going forward. And of course, the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe will be meeting with President Trump this Friday in Washington to discuss a number of trade issues, basically trying to salvage some sort of relationship after Trump squashed the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, the TPP, that would have been the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific region. And now basically Abe is looking to see if he can salvage some sort of bilateral agreement with the U.S. and go forward from there. So it should be very interesting to see how that meeting takes place.
Destroying the TPP on the American part, does that give China more leverage?
It certainly does, and it was no surprise at all back in November when China started floating the idea of their own, if not replacement for the TPP, at least their own idea for a free trade zone that would be China-led instead of U.S.-led. So I think this is a prime opportunity from the Chinese perspective to try to take some of that energy that, well, the years of energy that have been spent in trying to prop up the TPP deal, seeing if they can do a kind of judo move to deflect that energy and make it back into China's credit. So it will be very interesting to see how that plays out. But I think for the time being, Japan is still primarily concerned with its U.S. trading relationship, obviously being one of the cornerstones of the Japanese export-based economy.
China's foreign reserves fell below $3 trillion last month, the first time in nearly 6 years it's been that low. What is China doing to try to control currency fleeing the country?
China is facing what is referred to as the impossible trinity problem. The idea here is that a central bank can lower interest rates in order to maintain fixed exchange rates with other currencies, but in doing so, that puts pressure on capital outflows because people are more inclined to seek higher interest rates elsewhere. So the free capital flow has to be staunched, and of course that gives up the ability of the central bank to maintain its capital free capital flows. This is a dilly of a pickle, as they say, for China, which is obviously facing increased pressure to try to bring currency stability. But of course, that currency stability comes at the price of staunching capital outflows, and even so, as you say, their reserves are decreasing. So it is an extremely difficult position. They're trying to thread a needle that really has never been threaded before in history, at least not quite like this. And there's an interesting article up on Investopedia just from the last 24 hours about how precarious is China's economy, where they say they don't believe that it's quite the dominoes, sky is falling, everything's going to collapse, the debt bubble is going to burst all at once, but they still think that it's obviously China is trying to find a way to transition into lower GDP expectations and to rejigger their economy, and there's going to be a lot of bumps along that path. And I think one of them, as we see, is going to be that extreme swings in reserve rates, in the reserve that they have and that they're trying to use to try to stem some of these capital outflow problems.
Trump complained about the low yuan, but frankly, isn't China trying to boost its currency right now?
Yes, exactly right. They are trying to at least not try to prop it up more than it would be otherwise. And of course, that would probably still mean a devaluing currency, but not quite devaluing as much. They're trying to prop it up, which is, of course, exactly the opposite of what they've been accused of doing, and which I think they were rightfully accused of doing in years past. But in more recent years, I think they have been trying to maintain currency stability, and I think that's exactly why the reserves are draining, and they're pumping a lot of liquidity into the system to try to keep things ticking along. But it really is a question of how long they're able to do that and fulfill their promises to the IMF and other institutions that they would maintain convertibility of the yuan. It's difficult to do that if there's a large capital outflow problem, and they are running out of reserves, or at least they see the possibility of running down the reserves too much and causing other types of problems that they didn't want to cause in the first place.
Well, Bitcoin is surging on reports that apparently people are using it to avoid China's currency controls.
Interestingly enough, there are reports coming out now that the People's Bank of China has successfully completed its own blockchain-based digital currency prototype system, and it is one step closer now to being the first major central bank to issue its own digital currency. So I think what is being planned here, and I think elsewhere around the world, but China's an interesting case of it, is using the idea of a blockchain-based digital currency like Bitcoin, but basically issuing their own version of that. And of course, the idea here is not only it obviously cuts down on printing costs and other things like that, but also I think more importantly, it gives the PBOC complete oversight into economic transactions, complete transparency of all transactions that are taking place in the economy. It's really, I think, at this point, only a question of how long it takes to transition into that and what route they choose to go there. The PBOC could mandate usage and issue that directly into the economy themselves, or more likely, as is the case now, they would provide that liquidity of that digital currency to banks, which then would use that for deposits in depositors' accounts. So that would be the way it would filter down to the economy. But I think one way or another, China is going to be transitioning into cashless soon, and of course it won't be Bitcoin in their view. It will be their own currency, which means one can expect the clampdown on Bitcoin is going to increase from here.
What about India's war on currency and gold?
Certainly we've seen just incredible destabilization taking place over the last few months in the Indian economy as a result of this demonetization. And it's very interesting. If the idea here was for the Indian government to basically get its hands on more taxable income, because people would be forced to declare it as they transfer their money over, it's been a failure, at least in certain respects, at least in certain areas. One of the governors of one of the provinces of India has come out to say that they are actually collecting less tax revenue now because of the economic slowdown that's taken place as a result of this demonetization. But on the flip side of that, now they not only have caught a lot of people who had undeclared money floating around outside the system, who've been forced to turn that into the banks to collect the new money, but they're now also proposing a new system whereby the country's biometric ID, which has been issued over the last several years, it's collected the fingerprints and iris scans of the vast majority of the population. Upwards of 99% of the population are now entered in the biometric ID database, and pretty soon the tax department is going to be tying people's taxes into their biometric ID. And they're already issuing, obviously, biometric ID cards. Those cards are going to be part of a new payment system that the Indian government is working on launching. So you'll be able to buy things by swiping your finger or scanning your iris, which, again, I think leads to complete transparency of every economic transaction. It will be tied directly to your fingerprint. It's going to be quite a thing to behold. And it's quite remarkable, really, because of course places like China and India have been far behind the game, as I suppose, as it has played out the world over in terms of getting people onto the tax grid. Well, they're looking to leapfrog into the complete total state of surveillance, whereby they'll be able to control every transaction. So again, it will be very interesting to see how that plays out.
And how are people going to get around it?
Good question. And also security issues that come with that, because as we, I think, are starting to find out more and more, obviously these biometric systems can be duped, can be, in fact, Japanese researchers just did a test with a regular consumer camera. They were able to take pictures of people flashing the peace sign, as people generally do when they're taking a picture here in Japan. And from those pictures, you could actually get people's fingerprint details to the point where you could make your own copy of them and then presumably use them to access biometric systems. So this is clearly not a stable or a completely secure technology. And add to that the fact that if your password gets compromised, you can change your password. But if your fingerprints get compromised, what are you going to do? That will never change. You cannot change your fingerprints. So we are entering a very brave new world, and I think there's a lot of ramifications of this that people haven't even begun to consider yet.
Well, I know when fingerprint ID came out for computers, and that was several years ago, I talked to a critic who said, what do you leave behind your path every day more than anything else? Fingerprints. Mm-hmm. They're everywhere. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you can get them off a doorknob, or, you go into a reception area, it's on a desk. We're going to have to what? Wear gloves?
Well, I guess that would be the low-tech solution. I think that it's just a failed paradigm, but I think they're probably, rather than just staying with fingerprints, they're going to be working on probably two-factor identification. That's why the international body that's created the standards for biometric ID, the ICAO, has two-factor authentication as part of that protocol, which generally involves a digital photograph of the face, which will include biometric details of the face, and fingerprints, so that they can both be matched. There's lots of other biometric details that can and presumably will be used in the future, including such things as the way you walk, your gait, can actually be used to identify you. The way in which you type apparently is one of those factors that they can use for identification. So I'm sure they're going to roll out a number of different things over the years, but I think fundamentally the security problems remain.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after the break.
Gem International is a new diamond explorer in the richest diamond producing country in Africa, located next to the fourth largest producing diamond mine in the world. International Spotlight is on an 1109 carat diamond recently discovered in Africa by a fellow Canadian junior with a proven operator and finance team. Gem International trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol GI. Visit us at gemdiamondmining.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, what about this conversation between the Australian PM and Donald Trump? Apparently it did not end happily. And what are they thinking about? What does that mean for relationships with other countries in the U.S.?
Yes, well, it's just part of this bluster of this flurry of activity that we've seen on the diplomatic front between Trump and various people. It's very, it's certainly a destabilization that's taking place across the board, and whatever did or did not take place in that call, and it's been denied that Trump hung up on the Australian Prime Minister, but whatever happened, I think we can understand that things have soured on a number of fronts, even amongst the absolute most staunchest allies of the U.S., and it's hard to think of a country that has been more supportive of everything that the U.S. has ever done than Australia, which has committed its own troops to basically every American military engagement over the last half century. Australia has always been there and always willing to contribute in Vietnam and elsewhere. And it's certainly a testament to just how destabilizing this new Trump administration is, that it's willing to throw things like that under the bus and question that fundamental relationship because of promises that were made in the Obama administration about accepting refugees. But I think that just goes to show how completely willing the Trump administration is to to completely upend the table and rewrite some of these relationships. And it will be interesting to see what the ultimate effect of this is, because the message seems to be, at least at this point so far, unless you are, even if you are willing to bend over backwards for the United States, you might be thrown under the bus. So it could very well create that interest in countries in turning away from the U.S. and away from a U.S.-led unipolar world. And in fact, we've seen Australia itself talking about the possibility of moving into more of a Chinese-led trade deal in the wake of the TPP scrapping. We had Australian Trade Minister Steve Chobo musing about that last November. So we're starting to see this shift taking place, and it's very possible that one result of this could be the alienation of some of America's staunchest allies.
Right, and Canada's Finance Minister Bill Morneau had a panel put together to take a look at what should Canada do with its business interests, and they were told the best idea, get more relationships with China and the rest of Asia.
I think it will be coming more down to a choice in a way that it hasn't been so clear-cut before. And that choice may be forced. The hand may be forced. And it would be certainly it would be a huge shift in the Canadian economy, and it's by no means certain that China and other markets would be able to take up that place that the U.S. obviously has in terms of the Canadian economy. But with the scrapping of NAFTA and whatever else may or may not be coming down the line, certainly I think Canada would have to be looking at other trading partners at this point so that all the eggs are not in one basket.
Some people are also mentioning that with the U.S. unemployment rate below 5%, if Trump did boost the number of jobs, it could have a labor shortage, which would mean higher labor prices, inflation, and perhaps a slowing of the economy.
That's fairly speculative at this point. It is certainly something that could happen, but maybe we should wait to see what does actually eventuate from that. I think, again, another wild card in all of this is the Federal Reserve that is signaling 3 rate hikes this year. But then again, they were signaling, I think, 4 rate hikes last year, and they only got to 1 of them. So I would take that with a huge grain of salt. But I think the Federal Reserve probably will hike rates again, at least once this year. And that will create some potential headwinds for this idea of some, fast expanding economy. We'll certainly see. We'll see how this plays out and what different factors come about as a result of it. But I think maybe Trump and his supporters might not want to be counting those extra jobs before they hatch.
Yes, and even with the return of factories to the U.S., factories don't employ people anymore. They employ robots.
Increasingly so. And I was just reading a headline of the story. I didn't read into the details, but it was about a factory in, I believe in China, that had gone to over 90% automation and had reduced errors in production by 80%. So win-win-win for the owners of the factory, certainly not win-win-win for the workers. And we'll have to see. I think that's going to be the increasing story of the year, and if not this year, then in the coming years, is going to be about replacement of vast sections of the workforce. And we already saw last year the first trial run of a trial delivery of Budweiser via a robot or an AI-driven truck. So again, I think huge sections of the economy are going to be really overturned by this automation that's really starting to come online increasingly these days, and it's going to start affecting even segments of the economy people might not expect. I've talked in the previous year about for example, an office in, I believe it was Brighton in England, where they had replaced some of their office workers with robots that can do that kind of paper shuffling office work. Again, it's going to start affecting more and more people, and that certainly will, I think, call into question this idea that the Trump administration is going to be a job-creating one.
Yes, and governments rely on income tax to fund their activities. What happens when people aren't making any income? There
has been talk in the European Union about taxing automation replacements, AI workers and that sort of thing, so that they would still get their cut of that economic productivity. No surprise there. But again, yes, what does that mean for the average worker? And how do we cope with this? This is one of the reasons why the idea of a minimum living wage or a standard universal payment has been floated more and more in recent years. The idea that people will be paid a certain amount simply for existing, and that will free people from having to engage in some of this menial labor that is quite fast being replaced. We'll see where that gets trialed and how that actually goes, but those are the types of ideas that are becoming more thinkable now that we are moving into what could potentially become a post-labor economy.
Well, the Jetsons said, we'd have all this leisure time, but maybe they didn't envision it this way.
Maybe they didn't think of who would be programming the robots. I don't know, but yeah, it's a Jetsons world, but maybe not quite as happy and carefree as the Jetsons. And it's going to be a lot of economic pain for a lot of people who get caught in the middle of that transition.
And will your robot maid talk back to you?
Good question.
James, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you for having me on.
My guest has been James Corbett, editor of the CorbettReport.com and contributing journalist to the International Forecaster. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show can be emailed to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.